Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. This is your last chance to leave the room if you came to the wrong session. This is integration, authentication, best practices. There's some people who, their head might spin with that many words in the title. It might be Scrabble. We just won. Hopefully, you're all here because you want to be here and you want to learn about integration and authentication. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I will tell you one quick piece of administrative stuff. You can see both myself and Silas's Twitter handles up there at the bottom. It'll also be at the bottom of every slide. And immediately after we finish this talk, we'll post a link on Twitter to the actual content of this deck, right? So you can grab it and have it to refer back to. In addition, we were just informed that this session is being recorded both in audio and video, so it will be made available after knowledge through the community. So let's go ahead and get started. Real quick, I'm Brian Barnard. I am a senior manager on product management for our new IoT team. And previously, I was working as a platform product manager for about the last 3.5 years, focusing on things that enabled our integrations, things like our APIs, our interfaces, authentication, some of our notifications, and some of our products that were recently released in Kingston and that you're going to learn about at the keynote tomorrow morning as well, that really make integrations easier for our customers to build and maintain. I've been working in software for about 15 years, and I've really always been focusing on integrations, authentication, making systems talk to other systems, and enabling that to happen to sort of increase the value of systems and the outcome that people achieve by using applications, whether they be cloud or hosted. And I'm joined here today by Silas Smith. We'll give an opportunity to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Silas Smith. I'm an engineer that's been with ServiceNow, I guess, for a little over 4 years now. I have about 14 years of industry experience. I've also joined the IoT team just recently, but I've spent most of my time at ServiceNow as part of our platform development team. And a lot of the things that Brian has been a product manager for, I've been his corresponding kind of dev manager, dev lead. Because we're required to work as a pair, we moved to IoT together. Really my heart and my soul and my interest is in integrations and really authentication protocols.
Thank you. So this is actually Silas and I's fourth knowledge presenting together on topics related to integration and authentication and things like scripted REST APIs. So hopefully we've only improved over that time, and you'll be really the judge of that. So what are you going to learn here today? Why did you come? Effectively, we're going to give you a quick overview of integration capabilities because we never know for sure how much background or familiarity you have with the ServiceNow platform when you walk in. So we just want to cover an overview really quickly. Then we're going to make sure that we talk to you about the types of authentication that are supported, primarily for either requests coming in over web services to ServiceNow or going out, which is our most commonly used integration pattern. And then we're also going to go over some best practices we recommend you follow regarding authentication to integration. So getting started, we want to cover a quick overview of the integration capabilities. And this is the slide that I think speaks to it the best and in a little bit of a concise way. But effectively, we start from the left-hand side. And we have two types of communication that come into a ServiceNow cloud-hosted instance. Right? We've got communication over HTTPS. And that's true of whether it is an integration with web services coming into our SOAP or our REST APIs, or if it's the mid-server communicating to the instance. It's still going to be over HTTPS. And then we also have email, which you might be surprised to see up there, but email is a very commonly used method of integration with ServiceNow. Been around for a very long time. We've got inbound email actions that allow emails to come into the system. You can grab and parse that data into some type of a structure, and then enforce actions and rules against that to take actions in your instance, whether that be a workflow or simple record creation. If you're coming in over HTTPS, you're going to come into our SOAP or our REST APIs. We have both platform-provided, ServiceNow platform-provided APIs, things like the table API, the import set API, the attachment API, and so on. Full list of those can be found at developer.servicenow.com. And then we also give you the ability to create your own APIs, both in SOAP and REST. So things like the scripted REST API and scripted SOAP interfaces allow you to create those custom web services for your systems or for the integrations that you want to put on the platform. And then outbound, right? So this is ServiceNow communicating to other systems. We have capabilities like our integration APIs, REST message v2, SOAP message v2. There's a couple other APIs that allow you to make communication or make calls out of the instance. We have things like our data sources, which we use to reach out and pull data into a ServiceNow instance from third-party systems, either directly or via the mid server. And then we also have export set capability to push data on a regular basis to files in the mid server. One that's new up here that you might not have seen before is Integration Hub. And to state it simply, you can think of it as the vNext of our orchestration capability. It's tied to another new product that was also released in Kingston called Flow Designer, which is a new workflow engine and workflow UI for building business logic on ServiceNow. Integration Hub takes that and adds on integration capabilities to it. And I'm going to give you a brief preview of it today in the context of our talk, and then you're going to see more about it either in tomorrow's keynote or hopefully you've already attended sessions or labs where you've seen it already at Knowledge 18. On the far right-hand side, we have some of those external targets, right? The various type of systems that we can make calls out to. This is not an exhaustive list. This is growing. What you're not going to see up here is a lot of specific application integrations, things like maybe a Salesforce or a Jira. We're really showing here the protocols that we can communicate with and the methods by which we do that. ServiceNow does have pre-built integrations to some third-party systems, and we continue to invest and grow that set of third-party integrations. One thing to note about here about the mid server, it's displayed a little bit differently. We can use the mid server to go out and proactively interact with systems inside of your environment, right? By inside of your environment, I mean behind your firewall or in any place you've installed instead of a mid server. It's important to point out that that mid server only communicates from the mid server to ServiceNow. ServiceNow does not initiate connections to the mid server itself. The mid server calls ServiceNow. So you really have control of how that mid server that's hosted inside of your environment communicates with ServiceNow. And that's an important security mechanism. So moving into the best practices part of our talk, we're going to go out with number one. And this one might seem a little odd to see up here, awareness. It's a little less prescriptive than some of the others. But I think this is also number one for a reason. You need to be aware. You need to be aware of some of the authentication mechanisms that exist, both inside ServiceNow or both that can be used with ServiceNow, and in general, what authentication mechanisms are being utilized and are becoming more and more common or being required by third-party systems. And so we're going to cover a few of these and also give you some resources that we recommend you look into to always stay aware of what's happening in this space. And so the first one I hope is just completely boring for lots of you, but I always want to cover it just really quickly, is basic authentication, right? This was a simple authentication scheme that came out with HTTP. It came out with HTTP, I think 1.0, and it's been around for a long time. It's really easy to use. It's very popular when you're first starting to build web service type integrations and authentication, and the fact that it's just a header. What we see here in that black box with the white text is a simple GET request coming against our REST table API. And the authorization header is there, it's in bold, and it's basic authentication. We've got a string that says basic followed by some incomprehensible text, but it's really a string of numbers and letters. All it is base64 encoded, and it's important to point out how simple it is. It is not encrypted, right? It's just a username, followed by a colon, followed by a password, smashed together, right, concatenated, and then encoded to base64. So what's important to know about this? It's important to know that A, it's not encrypted, but a lot of people have questions for us saying, hey, I can't use basic authentication. My security team has concerns about Basic Auth, I can't use it. I don't completely agree with that. I think it's just important to be aware of it. Effectively, as long as you're only ever using TLS for that communication protocol, like transport layer, then it's still encrypted by the transport layer, right? The risk, the concern to have about basic authentication is that username and password that's encoded, if you don't change it very frequently, it is potentially susceptible to a man in the middle and a replay, right? Because that's not changing very frequently. You replay the message and it could be received and authenticated. Another thing to note, and you'll see this continuing throughout our slides, is the RFC number in the bottom left-hand corner. And again, a great reason to download the deck. This is a Googleable. We look for the RFC, take you to IETF where they store these standards and specifications. And if you want more detail, you can go right there and read up and get the full specification. So moving past Basic Auth, I'm going to jump into OAuth and hand it over to Silas to cover that.
Thanks, Brian. One of the other potential issues that comes up with basic authentication is that it also requires you to really trust your client, because you're giving that client your username and password, or the username and password of something that represents like your service account or what have you. So if that client is part of your ecosystem and you trust it, then everything is fine. If the client is actually a third party that you don't want to have your password, then basic authentication is actually really problematic to actually require you to give your password away. OAuth was introduced as an authorization protocol to handle exactly that situation. So when you have a third party that needs to access information from a resource that's not owned or protected by that particular party, they're separated by like a different organizational boundary. You'll commonly see this in something like, if you're using an app on Facebook, you might get redirected out at some point saying like, hey, Facebook Farms is requesting to access information from your Facebook profile. Do you want to allow that? That's exactly an OAuth authorization flow, where it's relying on you, the resource owner, to be given the choice to grant access to your Facebook data. Under the hood, you're getting redirected out to Facebook to authenticate with Facebook, so Facebook gets your password. It is your Facebook password, so that's fine. And then redirected back to the third-party application with an access token that grants you temporary access to that data. So this is a way to negotiate that third-party exchange of data without actually having you give away your Facebook password. Sometimes you'll see this implemented a number of different ways, and where I think OAuth kind of breaks down in terms of like really being a real flexible, widely applicable protocol is in what happens with token validation. So OAuth is very prescriptive in the specification about how tokens are issued, how to actually complete the protocol to obtain a token, how they can be used. But when it comes time for the resource server to say, hey, some client just sent me a token and is trying to access this resource, is this a valid token? OAuth doesn't say anything at all. It's completely like, oh, that's just up to you. So oftentimes you'll see this implemented different ways. The authorization server might offer an API point to validate tokens, but it's not part of the spec. It's just a one-off implementation that authorization server decided to provide. Sometimes, like in this example, the resource server and the authorization server are part of the same ecosystem, and maybe they have access to the same database where the tokens are stored, and so the resource server can just do a database lookup and find it. So it gets really weird, though, when it's actually crossing organizational boundaries and you're trying to build things in a really generic, kind of standardized way, because this resource server doesn't have a good way to consistently, reliably validate tokens without doing like one-off API calls, or having to make those API calls and then introducing like additional latency into your application just trying to validate the token. OpenID Connect is an extension that was built on top of OAuth to address exactly that problem. I'm going to have Brian talk through that.
Cool. So one other thing I want to point about OAuth 2.0 is ServiceNow currently supports OAuth 2.0 both for making calls to a third-party system, right? So if a third-party system requires OAuth authentication, we support that, as well as supporting OAuth for inbound authentication for calls to our REST APIs. OpenID Connect, as Silas mentioned, seeks to build on top of OAuth 2.0, right? It's a layer on top of that. It also combines and works with JWT, which Silas will tell you more about in a minute. OpenID tries to solve a specific problem. It says, OAuth didn't really tell us anything about how I identify the requester. It says, you're going to have these authorization tokens, but in OAuth, but in OpenID Connect, it specifically says we're going to have an identity token. And the identity token is going to use JWT as a format, and that has some specifications of what it's going to contain. And it also says how that identity token can be verified, right? How you can actually check the signature to validate that the token is intact. And then also, it specifies that the OpenID Connect provider will give a REST API that the client can make a call back to get more information about that user. So we can go look up more details about that user to then display them in the calling application. Now the reason I have the Facebook and Google logo up here is because sometimes it helps to understand what this is enabling. OpenID Connect is enabling the social logins that you see all over the web these days. Things like login with Facebook or sign in with Google. The list goes on. If somebody is an OpenID Connect identity provider, they can then be used as a social login to log in the system without your users having to create another account. Today, ServiceNow does not support OpenID Connect for users logging into the ServiceNow instance. We do support some authentication for integrations using OpenID Connect and identity tokens. And that's new as of the London release, and Silas is going to demo that for you in just a few minutes. So again, just to point out, OpenID Connect, some capabilities are afforded to you in the London release. We'll give you more details, but in terms of your users logging in, going to a login page, choosing to log in with Google or Facebook, is not supported yet at this time.
So JWT. JWT is another standard that is basically an encoded data exchange format. So we've listed the standard up at the top. It's broken down in terms of 3 components when you actually look at it. What you're seeing at the bottom is the encoded representation of the JSON web token. So the same as the basic authentication example, it's using base64 authentication. So nothing is encrypted here. It's entirely just encoded. So you can actually go to a decoding tool like JWT, which I'm actually going to show in a second, and take a look at what's inside of these tokens. So it's broken down in terms of a header, which is metadata about what's in the payload. There's the actual payload, which could be any data that's relevant. It's basically in JSON format. And then a signature that can be used to validate that everything that was in the payload is in fact validated according to that PKI signature. Auth0's put out a really nice tool called JWT.io, where you can go and just drop in one of these JWTs, and it'll spit out the decoded representation. So you can see the header component just telling you what signature algorithm was used to sign this token. You can see the payload data, because these aren't actually encrypted, as I mentioned, and then some information about how to validate the signature. So that's a really useful tool. And in a minute, I'm going to demo how we actually use this and have added support for this in our London release to provide integration authentication with an external identity provider.
So APIs keys come up as well. So we get sometimes questions, does ServiceNow support API keys, or what are API keys? We don't support API keys as a way to authenticate to our REST APIs, but you're going to hear about APIs supporting these from time to time, and they're very tempting to use and sometimes popular with developers because it's really nothing more than a string. Right? It's a defined string. It feels really good to use this when you're a developer trying to get something up and running. You go to a website, you say, hey, here's my account, give you my API key. You go hit Command-C, Command-V, and you copied it, and then you paste it into your code, and you're like, great, I've got this key, and the authentication works. 100 times simpler than OAuth. Not very secure, right? It's just this key. They don't say anything about when it needs to change. They don't say anything about like a time that it should expire. It's really just an agreed-upon shared secret at that point that you can use to make those calls. So I would caution you against APIs that just give you an API key. It's easy to get up and running. It's easy to use. But effectively, they're not following a real standard. There is no standard around just API keys. It's just a convention that you'll see used sometimes by APIs. It's often sent either as a header or a query parameter. If you've got a choice or an option and you have to use this, try to send it as a header instead of a query parameter. Right? By query parameter, we mean including it right after the get portion in the URL as a query parameter. So don't recommend using API keys as a best practice. I'd really look for some other type of authentication, even basic authentication, if you're going to have expiration on the username and password or force people to change it. If not, then OAuth, which has a mechanism for expiration of tokens, as well as refresh capabilities to get a new token. So one thing I want to point out as well about this awareness best practice is some resources. So we can only give you just like barely the tip of the iceberg in terms of some things while we're here in the time of our talk. And so I really would encourage you to look at some of these resources. First and foremost, IETF, which is a great source for all the specifications. We've been giving you links to their specs throughout our talk so far. OWASP in general is a great resource, and then specifically OWASP publishes an authentication cheat sheet, which will really give you, a short list of things that they're recommending, and they update from time to time. So it changes to take into account new practices, new patterns that are being recommended. OAuth.net, because I just got to tell you, OAuth is confusing, right? Silas tried to put up the most clear diagram up there he could, but it still gets a little confusing to know who the resource server is and who the authorization server is. OAuth.net's a great landing page to then break off and learn more about OAuth and really understand it. And then last is OpenID Foundation, right? That's the keepers of the OpenID Connect spec. One thing to point out about that that's really nice and helpful is that they also certify OpenID Connect identity providers. So if somebody like Okta or somebody like Azure AD or Ping Identity is going to provide that, maybe you're using them for single sign-on, they can actually go and be certified as an OpenID Connect identity provider. And those three are certified. I checked before I mentioned them. There's plenty more that are certified, but that means there's actually tests published by this foundation that can be run in an automated fashion to validate that that provider is meeting the spec, which is really helpful because then if you're running a client, that your client, as long as it supports the standard implementation of OpenID Connect, will be able to utilize that identity provider. So moving on to the next best practice, is a recommendation to use a central credential store. And we're going to show you one method of that in just a second inside of ServiceNow. But what we're saying here is the best practice is to utilize a central place where you store your credential information you're going to use for integrations. Maybe in ServiceNow today you've got a multitude of integrations running, and you've got script includes, and maybe you've got some REST message v2 records, and maybe you've got others implemented in other places, maybe as a workflow action, and you've baked either those credentials, username and password, either into a property, maybe you set up a special table to be used for that, or maybe they're just scattered all over the place. The outcome is that when something changes in that third-party system, maybe you move some code from one instance to the other, you've got to go look all over the place for those credentials. And inevitably, at least I made mistakes, you're probably likely to make mistakes. When you move to a new company, they're going to be looking all over for these credentials where they've been stored. A much better pattern is to be keeping them in a central place. What we've done in the Kingston release, and we'll be adding on to as well, is a central credential store in the instance. And so now, if I were to type, I've already got it up here in my favorites, you can see on the left, connections and credentials. I actually have a area in the instance where I can specify these. And let me just click into them really quickly. At the top level, we have a connection and credential alias, which is really like it's an association. It's a parent association for a connection I may want to specify, as well as a credential. The connection being some details about a third-party API that I want to call, like a base URL, or even the full URL that I'm going to call into. For purposes of my demo, I have something called the bScepter alias, which I'll click into. bScepter is just a really easy-to-use third-party service that'll reflect an HTTP request. It's helpful for the demo, as you'll see in a second. And then underneath there, I have this connection and credential alias specified. I've got my connection type, HTTP. My type here is connection and credential, so I've specified details of both the connection and the credential. I could have just chosen a credential in here. And I've got some connection details associated with it. I can click down into this connection details, open this guy up, and then I'll actually see what my connection is, what the connection URL I want to use, and I can go to the credential. The credential is where I've actually specified the username and password that I want to use in this scenario. And so far what I've shown you is really a couple tables that I store this data in a central place. But what we've done is we've also baked support for this into our Flow Designer integration hub so that I can really easily use it when I'm building those outbound integrations. So hopefully you've already seen this. If you haven't, it'll be a little new. I go to Flow Designer. I have a new user interface that comes up. If I say it again, maybe it'll happen right now. A new user interface that comes up. Thank you. That never works on time, so I'm getting lucky today. And I've got a demo flow. So just real quick, if you've never seen Flow Designer, raise your hand if you've never seen Flow Designer integration. Wow, okay. So Flow Designer is a new UI. It is the place where you go to design workflows for this new workflow engine, right, in ServiceNow. We call it Flow Designer, and it has flows, subflows, and actions. And effectively, a flow is what you expect it to be. It's a set of either a trigger and then multiple actions, which really is a workflow. And I can define both flows, but I can also define actions. And the action here is where I would go if I'm an integration developer and I want to build a reusable piece of code, right? Think about it like I'm going to build a Lego that my business process analyst can reuse and just easily drop into some process they have in place. So if I really quickly look at this action I've already created, and I can see that I've got the connection details at the top. And instead of me having to go in here and put a bunch of information about where I was going to make the call to, specify it as a one-off, I can actually choose an existing connection that I specified from that connection alias, choose the Bceptor one here, and it will be used anytime I use this action in a flow. If I go back up to the flow, I've pulled this in. I have one set, this demo K18 flow. I can see that I have a trigger followed by an action here. And what happens is if an incident's created, I'm going to actually go make this simple GET request to the beekeeper activity. Let me just show you really quickly what this looks like if I was going to choose another action. And hopefully this will be more familiar with you over time. You're going to see a bunch of it at ServiceNow at K18. If you haven't, I would suggest you take some labs for it because I can't go into the depth of it here. The simplest way to state it, though, is these are already pre-built actions to either do things in ServiceNow or do things with external systems, like make calls to external systems. We're really trying to make it much easier for you to do that and take almost like a IFTTT approach, a if this then that, simple approach to these type of workflows and integrations. And they read top to bottom. There's no more, a diagram that is only viewable one page if it's been, prettily organized. These read straight top to bottom, and we're using natural language so that more people can just read what's happening in the flow and understand what this thing is actually going to do. So let me jump back and do a test run. It's also convenient because instead of having to create an incident to have this run, I can simply click test. And the expectation I have is that it's going to make an outbound call using REST, that REST action that I just showed you, with the connection and credentials I specified to this third-party service. So I click test. I can choose an incident. I'm choosing an incident because my trigger is when an incident's created. So I want some of the details about that incident. I click run test. I can execute it immediately. It's processing the test flow. I put a wait on the Bceptor side to make it wait a couple seconds for the response. And the nice thing is, for anybody that's familiar with workflows as it exists today, if I wanted to go see what happened in that workflow, I'd be going to look for that workflow context. But instead here, I can click on the execution details. Directly from Flow Designer, I can go to the execution details for that individual flow execution. This is just the details of my test run. I see the trigger, I see the action, I can click into that action, I can click into the steps, and I can see details of what happened, right? I'm seeing this without having to go open up 6 different tabs, go search all over the ServiceNow instance to look in logs. It's right there. I see that I got a 200 back and a hello world. That's not only available when I do a test. Whenever I'm in Flow Designer, I can start out at the flow, and I can click executions and get to a list of all the executions of that flow. And we think it's going to be really a huge improvement for developers that are trying to debug, for analysts that have built business processes and they're trying to see when these things ran, instead of having to be a full ServiceNow admin to find out how I see the executions of my workflow. So that was a little bit off topic, just to give you some information. But what I want to show you is, yes, we made this call to Bceptor, right? Simple reflection. I click on this request. It was a simple get 200, and I look at the header. And what I have here is I used Basic Auth. Connection Credential Alias supports Basic Auth and OAuth as of Kingston, and we'll be adding additional types of authentication that get supported in connection and credential aliases. But this is just a base64 encoded concatenation of my username and password being sent across. And again, I'm just using Bceptor to actually show you that we made a call to a third-party system. Bceptor is just a free sort of developer testing tool. And that demonstrates how we can use connection and credentials to use a central connection store in ServiceNow. And that came out in Kingston and is also, of course, available in the London release as well. So with that, we're going to switch over to our next best practice, which is to use a central identity provider. And Silas is going to walk you through that experience.
Yeah, so this is something that we're seeing in terms of like where we see the industry going, this notion of a central identity provider. So today, Brian mentioned ServiceNow supports the OAuth protocol. Inbound API requests, we also support it on outbound. In this inbound scenario, a client basically authenticates to ServiceNow, gets an OAuth token, and then can use that token against ServiceNow and only ServiceNow to make API requests. You're making calls to things like the table API or scripted REST APIs that you built. But that token is only ever good for ServiceNow. That isn't really that useful if you need to integrate, if your client application needs to integrate with other systems. You know, integration is a big part of what ServiceNow does, integrations with other systems. And we know that we're not by any means the only system that you integrate with. So if your client application needed to access Box and then access ServiceNow, you'd have to complete 2 different OAuth flows to get 2 different tokens just to try to do what you're trying to do. So this notion of a central identity server is one where you'd be able to establish a trusted identity provider in your environment that all of your integration applications, your client applications, will authenticate against that central identity provider, ideally once, be issued using the OpenID Connect protocol, be issued an ID token that represents your user, and then be able to use that ID token that was issued by the OpenID Connect provider against APIs like ServiceNow or Box or others. So this is something that we added support. We're adding support for this in our London release using OpenID Connect and external identity providers. So I'm going to actually demo this right now. So we are going to do a little demo with Okta. So I set up an Okta developer site or a developer application. As Brian mentioned, this could be any OpenID Connect provider. We'll start in the instance, and I'm going to actually start at the provider configuration. So if you were to type OAuth into the, not there, into the navigator, this is under the application registry. This module already exists. We added a new type of OAuth provider called OIDC provider. So this demo app registry basically represents my Okta application that I have in the developer console. So this is the client ID that Okta gave me. And then you can see that it's referencing this OIDC provider configuration. So this is a new thing where this is how we're establishing trust with the identity provider. OpenID Connect mandates as part of the spec that the provider support this URL, the well-known OpenID configuration. So we're going to go out and take a look at this. This is something, you don't have to be authenticated to see this. This is public data. But this basically tells your client application how to integrate with this provider. So you have the URLs for the authorization endpoint, for the OAuth protocol, the token endpoint. There's a JWKS URI, which specifies the keys that can be used to validate tokens that were issued by this identity provider. So you can notice that this key here has a key ID starting with BS01. And then it contains, this is like the public key component of a PKI pair for validating the signature. And we'll see that in just a second. So we're going to see how we can use this in ServiceNow to validate tokens to make API calls without the token actually being in ServiceNow ahead of time. So I've got a scripted REST API that I built, which simply echoes, who am I? So get the logged in user and return it. And I'm going to send this request right now without any token at all. And it should fail with, hey, I don't know who you are. You didn't give me an authentication token. So we're going to go generate a token and then come back and make this API call again. I want to copy this, and then before I send it, I want to actually just break it apart here. So I'm going to use Postman to display the details here. Postman's a really nice API testing tool for building HTTP requests and sending them and viewing the response, the headers. So it's a really useful tool. Hopefully that's big enough. I'm going to only use this not to send the request, but to actually just split apart the parameters here so that you can see what's in this request. This is an OAuth authorization request, and we're requesting an ID token. So the response type is set to ID token, and we've requested the OpenID and the profile scopes, which is part of the OpenID protocol. We've also specified a redirect URI, which basically tells where the identity provider, after authenticating you, should redirect the client browser back to, which is basically like the hook back into your application. So now I'm going to switch over to the browser and actually send this request. And I'm going to, before I do that, open up my network tab and send the request. So actually, since that's going to get in the way, we don't need it. You can see that I sent the request, but it redirected me right away to log in. And this is, again, my Okta developer account. I'm going to log in as Brian here because we were having some beers last night, and he gave me his password.
Never happens.
So, okay, I logged in, and nothing happened, right? Actually, if you look in the URI, it's really small, but you can see that it redirected me out to my getpostman.com URI. And in the URL fragment, there's an ID token. I wish that I could increase the font size, so sorry about that. We're actually going to copy and paste this right now anyway. But the ID token that we want came back in that response. So we're going to copy it out and then head out to jwt.io and just paste this token in. So you can see here, in the header, it specifies the key ID. There's that BS01 and the whole key ID from my Okta configuration. The signature algorithm is RSA-256. And then in the payload, it contains a lot of information about Brian's user account. It contains who issued this token. It contains, this is my client ID, the audience. It also contains a random token, a secure random token, to introduce that level of that extra level of security. It specifies when the token expires and some other information. And then, of course, the signature can be used to validate that. So we're going to now head back to the API call. And so we didn't do any interactions with ServiceNow. We went out to Okta and obtained this token, and that was it. But we're going to drop this in here. It's really long, but that's okay. These are computers. Send the request. And now we can see that we're successfully authenticated, and the user account is Brian Barnard. And just so that you know I didn't pull a magic trick, I'm going to actually just remove a couple characters from the signature. And now the signature shouldn't validate because it's actually not a digitally valid signature, so we get a failure to authenticate. This is, again, all stemming from that trust relationship that we established here in the provider configuration. So by activating this as an OIDC provider and specifying the well-known configuration, the admin is basically saying that, hey, this ServiceNow instance trusts this identity provider. And if you give me a token that was signed by that provider, I'll authenticate you. This is also working because Brian's user account already existed in our instance. If I was to go to the users table, you'd see a user record or a row for his user account. And we expect that to be a common scenario, but there's another use case where his user account might not have actually existed yet. So back on the main app registry configuration record, there's a tab here for user provisioning. So this basically, if you're familiar with the LDAP user import and being able to provision users on the fly and define a transform map that's going to map how those users get created in ServiceNow in terms of their attributes, you can map all of the information from the JWT token, from the OpenID can expect, to user fields in ServiceNow. And so you can do that, if that makes sense for your use case, you can come in here and say like, hey, I want to actually provision users from these tokens. So I've never seen this user before, but I trust this identity provider and use the information that I get from the ID token to go and create a user account in ServiceNow and do something. So again, this is something that's available in our London release, and we're pretty excited about it. I think we're going to switch back to the presentation now and try to wrap it up.
Cool. Thank you. So something we got in the weeds there, and we try to get a little more in the weeds when we're doing our CreatorCon talks, and we try to be a little more technical in these abilities.
Engineer.
It's what we expect and what we want. But so the thing to point out is we will support any identity provider that is OpenID Connect certified. So this could be Okta, it could be Auth0, it could be Azure AD. If you go look at, could be Google Identity Platform, Identity Platform. If you go look at the list of OpenID Connect certified identity providers, you can be assured that those will work with ServiceNow in this capacity. And another way to think about this in different terms is previously, prior to this, for a third party for a user to make an integration call to ServiceNow, they had to have an account on ServiceNow. So you think of like integration account, or they had to have a OAuth token. Now we support using that account from that identity provider, like an Okta or another one, to make integration calls to ServiceNow. So you can imagine like almost like a single sign-on situation for integration requests to ServiceNow. Moving on from there, best practice number 4 is, and a common sense one I hope, is only ever use TLS. Really this means you're only using HTTPS for any calls. You're never just making a call to an HTTP endpoint. Using TLS means you're going to get the transport layer security and that your requests will be encrypted across the wire. This is pretty common these days. It's almost hard to find something that doesn't use this. But if you come across integration, somebody gives you an API endpoint that is just HTTP, I would strongly encourage you to push back on them and ask them to use TLS and get a certificate for their service. Best practice number 5 is logging and monitoring. And effectively what we're saying here is that it's really important to understand how to find the logging in ServiceNow or any other system that you're using relevant to authentication. So what I mean by that is every time a user logs in, every time a request is authenticated for integration or just for user logins, you should be familiar with how to go see that log. We log it in ServiceNow in the system log. And then when you can see it, helps you be able to debug, helps you be able to understand how people are authenticating your instance. But you also want to monitor it. And you're monitoring for potential malicious behavior, right? Somebody trying to make an excessive number of requests that are failing. That would be somewhat of an indication that somebody might be trying to do a pen test or try to test against your instance and try to use a password library, for example. So understand how to go see the authentication logging, whether it be on ServiceNow or in any other system, and then set up some basic monitoring. One way to do this on ServiceNow would be a simple business rule, or setting up a scheduled job to go do an aggregate and count how many times something's attempted to log in, and then send some type of automated incident creation if you want to, or security operations incident. We also support log shipping from the transaction or from the system logs, so you could be pushing some of those authentication logs into a third party like Splunk or another log shipping tool. Best practice number 6, I think Silas, you wanted to speak to this.
Sure, I think we're a little bit pressed for time, so we'll go quick. This one is also pretty obvious. You should use standards. Standards are what gives us interoperability and compatibility. They protect us from a security standpoint. The more you go away from standards, the more you're kind of left on your own. You're opening yourself up to vulnerabilities or incompatibilities. It's a really easy one, whether if you're trying to provide justification for why you made a certain choice and your justification is, well, because that's the standard, you won't get a lot of pushback on that because it just makes sense.
To give you a brief example of that, the demo you saw today during the keynote with Microsoft Teams, we needed to build authentication capabilities to work with Teams. And when we worked with Microsoft, we pushed to make sure we're using the OpenID Connect standard for that transfer of identity and authentication. Each time you type a message in Microsoft Teams, a request is sent to that ServiceNow instance, and we're receiving an identity token. And it's adhering to the OpenID Connect standard to authenticate and really identify who that requester is. I also want to give you a brief glimpse into the authentication roadmap for the ServiceNow platform, right? Where are we going? What are some of the new capabilities you should expect to see and that we're going to be working on for the next few releases? Quickly, I have to say, give it a safe harbor disclaimer. These are things we intend to work on, but there's no specification about when they're going to be released, what release they'll be included in, and it is subject to change. So first and foremost, OpenID Connect login. What I mean when I say this is for users, for interactive login. We need to add support, and we will work to add support for users to log in the UI of ServiceNow with an OpenID Connect login. So it could be something like Google, or it could be something like login with some other provider that supports OpenID Connect. You may be asking, why is that important? It's becoming important for us in our customer service management product, where when you're using it as a customer service management portal, you don't want to force your actual customers to go create an account with you on your system. They don't want to have to enter all their details again when they could just use Google or just use another provider to log into your system. Next up is JWT Bearer Grant, and I'm going to let you look this one up for more details. Effectively, people want to be able to send a JOT to ServiceNow and get a access token. This is for some specific integrations with third parties that are supporting this standard that we need to provide this capability for to enable us to build those integrations. And then we plan to enhance the authentication logging. So you heard me mention how important it is. We already log all authentication to the instance, but what we don't do is do it in a uniform way, right? Depending if it's SAML or if it's OAuth or if it's Basic Auth, there can be small variations in the information we're providing in that logging. We want to standardize this so that it's even easier for you to go into the logs and understand who's authenticating and how they're authenticating to your instance. And then it'd be easier for you to say, hey, I know 20% of my users are using Okta. Maybe a certain vendor is using Okta to authenticate into your ServiceNow instance. And then next up is to improve the OAuth client and provider configuration. We know that it's a little bit of a bear today going to configure the OAuth client and provider setup, and we want to improve that experience and drastically simplify it. Last but not least, we plan to add on. We're going to continue enabling those virtual agents and pushing them into additional chat mechanisms or chat tools. We need to look next at Facebook Messenger to add some of that virtual agent authentication, so we can get the identity of anybody communicating in Facebook Messenger as they've set up a ServiceNow chatbot to exist in that product. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so at this point, feel free to either raise your hand and somebody jump over to you the microphone. We've got a little over 2.5 minutes. I know it's short, but we'd be happy to take questions also in the hallway outside after this talk, or give you our contact information. You can email us or set up time to speak with us here at Knowledge 18. You can try to yell, or we can wait for a microphone.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Scripted REST API support for OpenID in London.
That's exactly the use case that I demoed, yeah, in London.
Yeah. So the question was, will scripted REST APIs support OpenID Connect authentication in the London release? The answer is yes.
Question? Same question?
Okay, great.
Great.
Any other questions
Right here.
while we're...
I'm sorry, what's the best practice for logging an authenticated user? Logging out an authenticated user. In an integration scenario, we actually don't treat those as like a full-on logged in session. So like I tend to think of those as like stateless interactions. Under the hood, like in our platform today, we do create a session, but it expires really quickly. And we don't see a lot of our clients actually binding to that session and reusing it. That your next request is going to include credentials and establish a new token anyway. So that's something that you kind of manage on your client application in terms of like what your identity policy would really dictate.
Does that answer your question, or is there more to it? Okay. Anybody else for while we're on the microphone? Right there. So the question is, if we were to recommend a specific type of authentication, which one would we recommend? A, for apps in our ecosystem. I'm going to interpret that as apps that are running on other ServiceNow instances. On the same instance? Okay, so, and the second part of the question is for apps that are not in our ecosystem, we're not on the same instance. So effectively, inside the same instance, there isn't a need to authenticate. You might be using a scriptable, like JavaScript API to make a call from one app to the other, and there isn't a need to re-authenticate. We already know who that user is. It's in the session, right? So we can track who's making that request, and then either provide or not provide access based on that session and their ACLs. The second part is apps that are off our platform. I would recommend at this point OAuth, right? OAuth 2.0, because effectively you're going to get the expiration of those tokens. You're going to pay a little bit more as a developer setting that up to make sure you're using the OAuth libraries and get it configured. But effectively, it's going to be a more secure mechanism in the fact that we're enforcing that token expiration, and that you're going to have people going back and have to get new tokens, and you're not susceptible to any replay of requests or man in the middle in that situation. Okay?
I think we're probably out of time, so.
Okay. So I want to thank everybody. I appreciate you coming to our talk. I know it's late in the afternoon. We're probably between you and the beer. Thanks for talking to us about authentication. Hopefully it was good that we got in the weeds. Please give feedback in the survey. We try to take that survey and make our future talks better. And then we'll post the slides out to Twitter momentarily, and we'll be happy to take some conversations and questions in the hallway. Thank you.